Ludwig Wittgenstein is one of the most curious and intriguing figures in 20th century philosophy. He published one book during his lifetime, the Tractatus Logico Philosophicus. It was published in his 20s, and his later work was published posthumously. It's the Philosophical Investigations. In his later work, he criticized his earlier work and did so in a way that, through that criticism, we can see a profound critique of modern philosophy. I'd like to begin with some biographical details. They're important for understanding Wittgenstein's work because he didn't come into philosophy through the ordinary ways. He wasn't classically trained, and the way in which he entered philosophy influenced his work both early and late. He was born in Vienna, Austria in 1889. His father was an immensely wealthy industrialist on the scale of the Carnegies and the Rockefellers in the United States. He was well schooled as a result, but he wasn't an intellectual. At the age of 9, he built a working model of a sewing machine from bits of wood and wire. In 1906, he went to study engineering in Berlin, and he became interested in the most romantic of the turn-of-the-century inventions, the airplane. In 1908, he went to Manchester, England, to become a research assistant in aeronautics. It was while he was in England that he became interested in philosophy, and the questions that interested him arose out of his study of mathematics as an engineer. At the turn of the century, there's very interesting work being done in logic and the foundations of mathematics by Gottlieb Frege and Bertrand Russell. Wittgenstein studied Frege's and Russell's works and went to Cambridge to study with Russell. Russell immediately recognized him as a genius and came to regard him as his philosophical successor at Cambridge. Wittgenstein only managed to study for 2 years before World War I broke out. The crisis occurred while he was at home visiting in Austria, and he joined the German army. I think to understand what Wittgenstein was interested in, you had to see what Russell and Frege were interested in. And here's a kind of a problem that they were concerned to resolve. It's sometimes called the problem of non-existence. Consider the sentence, Pegasus flies. Just the sentence, Pegasus flies. That seems like a meaningful sentence, but what's it about? Grammatically, the subject is the word Pegasus, so it seemed to be saying something about Pegasus, but Pegasus doesn't exist, so the sentence is about nothing. And if it's about nothing, it's meaningless. So that doesn't seem right. What are we going to do about this puzzle? Well, to think about this puzzle, it seems we need to know something about word meaning. In what does the meaning of a word consist? There are two views that I'm going to talk about today because Wittgenstein ends up criticizing both of them in a fairly profound way. And they're quite natural views. They're the kinds of ideas that come immediately to mind when I ask the question, in what does word meaning consist? The first is that the meaning of a word is a thing. And this works very nicely for proper names. So a name like Bill Clinton, the meaning of that name is the president, the person. The meaning of the name Mark Risjord is me. A word like horse, the meaning of a word like horse might be the set of all horses, or perhaps the property of being a horse. Now notice that this view gives us no help at all with the puzzle of non-existence. On it, a word is meaningful only if it corresponds to an object. So Pegasus flies is meaningless. No help at all. The second view is that the meaning of a word is an idea in the mind of a speaker. This is a venerable philosophical view expressed in a nice clear form by Locke. On this kind of view, a word like Pegasus has as its meaning an idea, perhaps a mental image in my mind. And flies, similarly, the word flies would have correspond to an image in my mind. Now, in this sort of view, I can meaningfully speak about non-existent objects. All I have to have for the meaning is to have an idea in my mind. But consider this a new sentence. Pegasus does not exist. That seems both meaningful and true, but of course, my idea of Pegasus does exist. Right? The word's meaningful, so there's an idea that corresponds to it in my mind. So Pegasus does not exist is false. Pegasus really exists. On this kind of view, it becomes impossible to say of anything that it doesn't exist, truly. Russell had an ingenious solution to this problem of non-existence. He suggested that the puzzle arises out of a linguistic mistake. Pegasus is grammatically a name, but logically it's not. It's an abbreviation for a complex description, say, perhaps, winged horse. So when we say Pegasus flies, what we're really saying is that there's something that has the following properties. It's a horse, it has wings, and it's flying. These predicates can be meaningful. They refer to, say, properties or ideas in my mind. And they all exist, no problem there. When I say Pegasus does not exist, what I'm saying is that there's no thing that has the properties of being a horse with wings and flying. So it can be meaningful and true. Russell's solution, I pause over this bit of technical detail, and there's more one can say. because it illustrates a very important point of philosophical method. It's a point of method that was central to analytic philosophy, which is a kind of philosophy that dominated English and American philosophy in the first half of this century. For the analytic philosophers, philosophical problems arise from linguistic mistakes. And this is why, on their account, philosophy hasn't made any progress. Philosophers in the past have made linguistic mistakes, gotten confused, been inspired to think about puzzles like the puzzle of non-existence, and then spin out elaborate philosophical theories that solve them. The problem is not to, the solution is not to give a philosophical theory, but to uncover why we got confused in the first place, in particular, why we got confused about the logic of our language. What we're going to do is focus on the logical form of the sentences, and through that either solve the problems or show why there wasn't really a problem there in the first place. Now, Wittgenstein, in his early work, was committed to this principle of logical analysis, and he thought that focusing on the logical form of sentences will help get us clear about metaphysical issues. And in his early work, the Tractatus Logico Philosophicus, he adopted the first view of meaning I mentioned a moment ago, the idea that the meaning of a word is a thing. In Wittgenstein's work, this is usually called the picture theory of meaning. The idea, on Wittgenstein's view, is that when we properly have analyzed a sentence, each element, each word will refer to a thing, and that what the sentence will have is a logical arrangement of those words that'll mirror the logical arrangement of the things. The Tractatus provided, in principle anyway, a method of analyzing every sentence into its ultimate logical constituents. Now, of course, since philosophical puzzlement arises from mistakes about logical form, follows that there's no more philosophy to be done. Wittgenstein recognized this. In the preface to his work, the Tractatus, he wrote the following: "This book deals with the problems of philosophy and shows, I believe, the reason why these problems are posed is that the logic of our language is misunderstood. The truth of the thoughts that are here communicated seems to me unassailable and definitive. I therefore believe myself to have found, on all essential points, the final solutions of these problems. And, if I'm not mistaken in this belief, then the value of this work is that it shows how little is achieved when these problems are solved." Wittgenstein wrote the Tractatus while he was serving in the German army during World War I, and he tried after the war unsuccessfully to publish it. He ultimately sent it to Russell and told him to do with it as he wished. Russell did find a publisher for it. Wittgenstein then proceeded to give up doing philosophy and go into training as an elementary school teacher. After all, he solved the problems. His work was done, right? He became an elementary school teacher and taught school in rural Austria between 1920 and 1926. He wasn't very good at it. At the end of this time, the people of the village more or less ran him out of town. He tried his hand at a couple of other pursuits. He was an architect for a little while. He worked on one of his house being built by his sister. In the meantime, in England, the Tractatus became an immediate classic. Russell found a publisher, had it translated. Russell himself wrote the introduction to the book, and when Wittgenstein finally saw the introduction, he didn't like it much. And scholars have since agreed that Russell probably misunderstood what Wittgenstein was doing. But the Tractatus became required reading for anyone who was serious about philosophy in the 20s in Cambridge and in England. Wittgenstein was eventually persuaded to come back to philosophy, came back to Cambridge in 1929. But by the time he did, his reputation was already huge on the basis of this one book. G.E. Moore, the Cambridge philosopher, happened by pure chance to meet Wittgenstein as he was returning to Cambridge. He was on the train from London to Cambridge. And when Moore got home, he said to his wife, "I saw God on the 5:15. Russell and Moore wanted Wittgenstein to teach, but of course he didn't have a degree, right? He'd only been at Cambridge for 2 years. So what they did is they had him submit the Tractatus, already a philosophical classic, as his dissertation, and they gave him an oral exam. They had to sort of do all the, have all the trappings of the degree. Gave him an oral exam on the Tractatus. So Russell and Moore fired questions at him, and he answered. At the end of it, Wittgenstein is said to have clapped them on the shoulder and said, "That's okay. You'll never understand it." Now, Wittgenstein spent the rest of his life criticizing his work on the Tractatus, and through that, the foundations of modern philosophy. And the result was arguably a radically new philosophical perspective, and that's what I want to focus on. Let me start with Wittgenstein's critique of the picture theory. For a question to ask about the picture theory is, how do words get connected with one thing rather than another. Why does a given word mean one object? Why does Bill Clinton refer to the guy in the White House and Mark Risjord refer to me and not the other way around? What's the connection between the words and the things that are their meanings? Now, to answer this kind of question, Wittgenstein devised the device of a language game. Now, a language game is a multifaceted concept in Wittgenstein's philosophy, and we'll see a couple of its aspects today. The first is that it's a philosophical tool. The strategy is to take a claim about language, a claim or a theory about language, and imagine that it's the whole truth about a simplified or primitive language. The object here is to fill out the philosophical claim, give it a clear sense, and, most importantly, find the limits of the claim. So it's a critical tool. Here's his suggestion for a language game that would exemplify the picture theory of meaning. He says, let us imagine a language for which the picture theory is right. The language is meant to serve for communication between a builder, A, and an assistant, B. A is building with building stones. There are blocks, pillars, slabs, and beams. B has to pass the stones, and that in the order in which A needs them. For this purpose, they use a language consisting of the words, quote, block, pillar, slab, beam. A calls them out. B brings the stone which he has learnt to bring at such and such a call. Conceive this as a complete primitive language. That's the philosophical investigations. Now notice how perfectly this satisfies a picture theory of meaning. Every word in the language stands for a thing. The meaning of the word block is a particular kind of thing. The meaning of the word slab is another. So when the builder says block, the meaning of the word is a thing, a block. Right? The meaning of the word slab is another thing, a slab. Now, sentences in this view are different combinations of names. And it goes by quickly in the quotation, but notice that different combinations in different orders mean different things. So if the builder wants a block and then a slab, she says, block slab. And the assistant will get a block, trot it over to the right place, and then go get a slab. Right? If you want a slab and then a block, you say slab block. Right? So you bring the slab first. In each case, a sentence is a picture of the sort of thing it's supposed to mean. Now notice, first off, how limited this language is. You can't say very much with it. For instance, you can't say 2 slabs. Right? Bring me 2 slabs. You can't say put them here. And Wittgenstein notices this and says, well, why don't we just add these words to our language, make it a little richer. We can do some more things with it. So we'll add the number words, 1, 2, 3, etc. We'll add here and there. So now the builder can say slab here, and the assistant will run over, get a slab, and trot it back across, put it in the right place. Or 2 slabs, right? But now, the language game no longer accurately represents the picture theory. Every word is supposed to stand for a thing, and sentences are supposed to mirror the facts. But what thing does the word here stand for? Right? Similarly with the word to. Right? Philosophers have often thought that number words referred to abstract objects, some sort of elusive, non-concrete sorts of things. But that just doesn't seem right in this language game. And compare 2 sentences. 2 blocks here, right, and slab block here. Now, according to the conventions of the game, the sentence slab block here means the slab goes over, bring me a slab, and then bring me a block, right? But 2 blocks here, if 2 is a name, then 2 blocks here means bring me the number 2 and then bring me a block. But that's absurd. That's not what the sentence means at all, right? The word to, like the word here, has got a different sort of role in the language game than the words for block and slab. Wittgenstein wrote that when we think about language, sometimes it's like, quote, looking into the cabin of a locomotive. We see handles all looking more or less alike, naturally, since they're all supposed to be handled. But one is the handle of a crank, which can be moved continuously. It regulates the opening of a valve. Another is the handle of a switch, which has only 2 effective positions. It's either off or on. A third is the handle of a brake lever. The harder one pulls on it, the harder it brakes. A fourth, the handle of a pump. It has an effect only so long as it's moved to and fro. The mistake of the picture theory of meaning is to treat all words as if they're names. Right? We look into the cabin of the locomotive and we see them all looking more or less the same. All the words look like they name something. Right? Perhaps they name something elusive. But when you look at it more closely, they're not all doing the same thing. They're not all functioning the same way. Words like here and to have got different functions. in the use even of a simple language game like the Builders, not to mention our more complex usages, than the words block and slab. Now, the clue here is, the sort of philosophical result is that perhaps by looking at the actual functioning of language, the way words are actually used, we might get some insight into the question about what word meaning is. And this might help us better to unravel the sorts of puzzles about meaning that arise. Notice that in saying that, there's a new and positive use for the concept of a language game. Language games in Wittgenstein's philosophy are also the real activities, practices, and social contexts in which language is used. So the idea here is that attention to real activities, real uses of language, will provide philosophical illumination. One thing we can illuminate, and Wittgenstein does, is the ancient doctrine of essentialism. Philosophers since Plato and Aristotle have often thought that concepts can be defined in terms of species and differentia. If you want to define something, you say what kind of thing it is, and then you list those features that make it different from other things of the same kind. So the concept of a beagle might be defined as a dog, that's its species, with short legs, long ears, and whatever else distinguishes it from dachshunds. Concepts on this view have a core of features exhibited by all and only their proper instances. In short, things have essences, and these essences are captured by the true definition of a thing. And notice how this doctrine of essences fits together very neatly with the picture theory of meaning. A word like dog or granite is going to refer to the essential properties of whatever dogs and granite, the essential properties of dogs or granite. Now, the critique of the picture theory that we get in the philosophical investigations also gives us a way of critiquing the doctrine of essences, and Wittgenstein used it this way. There are many language games which simply don't function in the way that the philosopher presupposes. We don't need exotic philosophical examples. Consider the word game. Right? This is one of Wittgenstein's examples in the philosophical investigations. What do all games have in common? What's the essence of game? Do they all have two players? Well, no. Solitaire doesn't have two players. Do they all have winning and losing? Well, no. If I'm bouncing a ball off the wall, I'm playing a game, but there's no winner or loser. Are they all played for fun? Well, it's not obvious that professional hockey is played for fun. We could go on looking further for essential features, but we've really gotten off on the wrong foot. What makes us think that there has to be some common core to the usage of the word game in order for it to be meaningful? Wittgenstein observed about concepts like this that they have a different sort of structure, what he called a family resemblance. And the metaphor is quite tractable. We recognize members of a family, but it doesn't have to be the case that they all have the same feature. So, Hannah has the same hair as Cousin Will. Cousin Will has Aunt Carol's eyes. Aunt Carol has the same high cheekbones as Andrea. Andrea and Hannah have got similar noses. There's a family resemblance. We can see the overlapping features, but they don't all have the same nose. There's not one single feature that they all share. Similarly, for a concept like game, Wittgenstein contended, there's no essential feature shared by all and only games, but there's lots and lots of overlapping features. So for any given case where we use the word game, we can say, well, it's similar to other games in these ways, right? So there's some overlap, there's no one single thing or set of things that runs throughout the whole set. The moral is quite simple, but it's also profound. Just because there's a word for something doesn't mean there's a hidden essence that unifies all the cases. Just because we have a word, we shouldn't, as philosophers, go running off looking for the thing that's going to correspond to it. Maybe it's hidden, like the number 2 or something like that. No, just because we have a word for something, it doesn't follow that there's a thing that corresponds to it. Now, this simple point has got enormous ramifications. Recall that Russell and Frege and analytic philosophers, and indeed philosophers throughout history, have thought that analyzing our concepts, analyzing language, finding sort of the logical structure of our sentences, would provide some insight into metaphysics. Might even give us some philosophical first principles. But if this critique that comes out of the philosophical investigations is right, language and logic don't mirror the world. Right? So we can't use an analysis of language or logical tools to give us as a source of philosophical principles. They're not going to yield metaphysical insight. So, how do words hook up with things, right? That was the question I started with. What's the connection between a name like Bill Clinton and the guy, all right? Well, the lesson so far is that we need to look at language games, the way these words are actually used, to unravel this kind of question. So let's look at a language game. Think about the language of the builders again. What's the connection between block and blocks? Well, we've got the story. The connection seems to be this. The builder says, block, right? And the assistant runs over and grabs a block and brings it over there, right? The builder says, slab, and the assistant runs over and grabs a slab. The connection between the words and the things, the reason that block stands for block and not slab, is that the connection is that that's the way the builder and the assistant behave. That's the way they act. Block is connected with blocks because when the builder says block, the assistant grabs this and not anything else. The connection between words and things is mediated by our linguistic practices. Now, we can easily extend this notion to game as well. It's a fact about our usage of the word game that there isn't always a single feature that we're picking out when we say game. In fact, there's a bunch of different things, and they have overlapping features. What we're describing when we say what the word game means is we're describing the role that it has in our linguistic practices. Now, the nice thing about this sort of view is that it doesn't homogenize language use. Not everything turns into a handle in the cabin of the locomotive. Not everything's a name. We can take a look at the differences between a word like to, or here, or game, or block, right? And see the real differences in their function, and that's going to be our clues to their meaning. In fact, it's going to be all of their meaning. The slogan of the investigations is, the meaning of a word is its use in the language. The meaning of a word is its use in the language. What's fundamental to linguistic meaning, on Wittgenstein's view, is the verbal behavior and the practices that surround it. We say a word, we utter a word in a particular kind of circumstance. The utterance is accompanied by certain kinds of actions. Things happen before it, things happen afterwards. This is its function. It's sort of its role in our linguistic economy. And those are the facts that ultimately constitute word meaning. The meaning of a word is its use in the language. Now, the thesis that meaning is use makes word meaning a public, social kind of thing. It's not a private fact. It's a fact about communities, ultimately. Meaning is on the surface of our linguistic practices, not hidden in essences. Now, there's a quite natural objection to this idea that meaning is a public thing. That is, in some cases, meaning seems to be a private matter. Consider the sentence, I have a headache. The headache's mine. I'm the one who feels it. In some sense or other, I'm the one who knows, perhaps the only one who could know that it was really there. So how could meaning be used for a word like headache? It's a matter of, it seems to me, a matter of naming or reporting my feelings, not something public. We don't pick up headaches and carry them around. Notice how this idea dovetails neatly with the other view of meaning that I mentioned at the very beginning of the lecture. That is the idea theory of meaning. I know I have a headache. I've got a word for it. I can name my experience. And when I say I have a headache, I'm referring to my experience or my ideas. And it's natural to extend this to all of language. Notice also that the idea theory of meaning is deeply entwined in modern philosophy. Think of Descartes and Descartes' project. Descartes set out to doubt everything that he could doubt. And one of the first things he comes to doubt is that there's anything really out there that there are really tables and chairs over and beyond his impressions of tables and chairs, over and beyond his ideas. And he's quite certain that he has certain sorts of experiences, certain sorts of feelings, certain sorts of visual images, but he doubts that anything out beyond himself can exist. Now notice what he can't doubt. He can't doubt that his words are meaningful. He's presupposing that in this world of sensation, he can simply label experiences as they come along, and he can talk about them, generalize about them. Much of modern philosophy arises from this sort of philosophical standpoint, the philosophical standpoint of starting with my experiences, then sort of working my way out, trying to understand how, prove that there is an external world, and see what kind of ontological structure it has. Wittgenstein recognized this presupposition of modern philosophy, and he recognized the objection about of the sentence, "I have a headache," a moment ago. And he called it into question in a very deep way, and in a passage that's usually called the private language argument. And this is, again, in the Philosophical Investigations. When thinking about the question of whether I can name my experiences, he wrote, "Let us imagine the following case. I want to keep a diary about the recurrence of a certain sensation. To this end, I associate it with the sign S and write this sign in a calendar for every day on which I have the sensation." So, sort of like Descartes, Descartes got his the sensations, and he wants to have names for them. So when a sensation comes along, he's going to recognize it and make a mark on his calendar. How the calendar got into the picture, I don't know. Don't ask me hard questions. He's going to make a mark on the calendar, S, every time he has the sensation. Now, we can ask the same question I asked earlier. What's the connection between the word and the meaning, right? What's the connection between the word and the sensation? Well, it seems perfectly transparent, right? Why can't I do that? But think about it this way. If a word refers to a thing or to a sensation, there's got to be a difference between correct and incorrect applications of the word. Right? I've got to be able to get it wrong. It's going to apply to some things and not others. And we can express these criteria in terms of rules. So for the block slab language, we have a rule that the word block refers to things like that. In the sensation language, the sign S refers to a certain feeling that I've got. So private language presupposes that I could propose rules to myself and judge whether I'm following them correctly. But on this philosophical picture, all I have to work with is my present experiences. The only thing I have to rely on is my feeling that this sensation is the same as the one I had yesterday. So when I write S on the calendar, I've got the feeling that I'm following the rule. But of course, all I have to work with is my present sensations. Right? The past sensation's gone. I have a present sensation and the feeling that this one's the same as the last one, the feeling that I'm following the rule. But I could have the feeling of following the rule and not be following the rule at all. That is, I could have the sensation, one sensation one day and the feeling, this is the same as yesterday, and a different sensation the next day and the feeling, this is the same as yesterday's. I could be having different sensations every day associated with this feeling that it's the same. Wittgenstein writes about this. In the present case, I have no criterion of correctness. One would like to say, whatever's going to seem to me right is right. And that only means that here we can't talk about right. If we can't talk about right and wrong, then there's no rule for the application of the word. Right? There's no rule, and the word has no meaning. It's an illusion that I could somehow, using only the resources of my present experience, have a rule that told me how to apply a sign like S to my feelings. The Cartesian picture and the picture of modern philosophy that shares that point of view rests on a philosophical fantasy. And that is the idea is that you could have correct and incorrect applications of a rule without appeal to anything independent. I could have correct and incorrect applications of a rule with nothing but the resources of my present experiences and my feelings that this is the same as the last one. But if Wittgenstein is right in the private language argument, that's impossible. It is nothing but a philosophical fantasy. So what did Wittgenstein think about a sentence like, "I have a headache"? Wittgenstein thought that psychological phenomena were necessarily two-sided. And he did a lot of work on this in the investigations, and he never himself came up with a really fully satisfactory account, but he wrote quite a bit about it. But the central idea is that a psychological term like headache has got to have both a feeling side and a behavioral side. Descartes, of course, sort of splits the two and makes the two independent. You can have the feeling and without the behavior, and have the behavior without the feeling. For Wittgenstein, our very concept of a headache involves both, or any sort of psychological term involves both a subjective feeling and particular ways of behaving. So people who have headaches typically behave in certain sorts of ways. Now, his argument for this sort of double-sidedness of our psychological concepts is that if they didn't have this sort of structure, it would be impossible for kids to learn words like headache, right? They'd never know how to apply this even in their own case. They would have no public criteria on which to rely. Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations is a profound critique of both his own early work and really the whole of modern philosophy. Much of philosophy has been engaged in trying to find the right description of the ultimate structure of the world. And philosophers have tried to cut through the language of the vulgar, ordinary language, to uncover the deeper logical forms that would reflect the true structure of reality. Now, this view pretty clearly depends on something like the picture theory. And if Wittgenstein's right in his critique of the picture theory, that kind of philosophical approach is not tenable. Other parts of philosophy have similarly depended on the idea theory of language. I've mentioned Descartes, but we could have mentioned Locke, Hume, Kant, Husserl. All of these philosophers took experience as a starting point for philosophy, and this presupposes the idea theory of meaning and the coherence of a private language. But if Wittgenstein's right, then that's not a possible starting point for philosophy either. So where does philosophy begin for Wittgenstein? It begins in the world with people and things and objects and tables and chairs. Now notice, of course, from this sort of standpoint, questions like the Cartesian questions about the existence of the external world or the existence of other minds don't make any sense at all. We've already started in a world with people and tables and chairs. There are still genuine philosophical problems. And in an interesting way, Wittgenstein in the philosophical investigations has transformed the method of analytic philosophy. As if you'll recall, Russell and Wittgenstein and the early analytic philosophers thought that by analyzing the logic of a sentence, they would be able to understand the logical structure of the world. So for them, philosophical problems are linguistic problems. But of course, Wittgenstein has already criticized that view. In the later Wittgenstein, philosophical problems remain linguistic problems, but it's not a matter of getting the right analysis of the sentence. Rather, philosophical problems arise when our language games get tangled. That is, we start using words that have a home in one language game with words that have a home in another language game, and we start to say things that we find puzzling. You know, what sort of object is the number 2? Right? That might take a lot of philosophical thought. We might spin out a whole philosophical theory. Wittgenstein says the appropriate response to that kind of question is not a philosophical theory, it's a kind of therapy. Right? What we need to do is to take a look at the language games where these words have a home, untangle them, and put them back in their place. And in the end, we don't end up with a philosophical theory, we end up with some peace. He wrote, philosophical problems are not empirical problems. They're solved, rather, by looking into the workings of our language, and that in such a way as to make us recognize those workings, in despite of an urge to misunderstand them. The problems are solved not by giving new information, but by arranging what we've already known. We get confused when our language games intertwine and get tangled, and the solution is to carefully attend to the actual usage of the words and untangle the language games. And when the philosopher's work is done, we don't have a new subtle theory. What we have is no theory at all. Philosophy, he wrote in the Philosophical Investigations, is a battle against the bewitchment of our intelligence by means of language. Thank you.